Hi everyone, Naomi here. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make your own sourdough bread. To get started, you will need about 1 1/3 cups of starter, about 2 1/4 cups cool water, approximately 21 degrees Celsius, 4 1/2 teaspoons of sea salt, and about 7 cups of flour. For a healthier bread, you can use Eureka flour, but for this video, I'm using cake flour. As a pre-note, your starter should be fed at least 3 times the day before to get it up to its optimum strength for baking. A starter is at its optimum strength and flavor 8 to 12 hours after it's been fed, and after that will begin to weaken. I've baked with my starter about 3 to 4 hours after its last feeding and still had great results. Note that if you're unable to care for your starter or are perhaps going away and will be unable to feed it, you can put your starter in the fridge where it will remain dormant until you are ready to use it again. You can then reactivate it by bringing it up to room temperature for 2 hours and then continue to feed it. If it's been dormant for more than a week, you must put it on a regular feeding schedule for 3 days before using it. If you feed your starter for several days and no activity occurs, your starter is probably no longer alive. The first thing you want to do is heap the flour into a bowl and make a hole in the center. Next, put the starter into the center and add the water. Begin to mix with your fingers until you have a slightly sticky but pliable dough. You may use a spoon to start mixing if you like. Now is the time to evaluate your dough. If your dough is too wet, add some more flour. If too dry, add more water. Don't add too much water though, as the dough is able to absorb more moisture than it can ultimately hold. And if too much water is added, the moisture will seep out as the dough rises. Note that it is, however, better to err on the side of too wet rather than too dry, as the softness of the dough is what helps to give the inside of the bread its open hole structure. Remove the dough from the bowl and knead for approximately 5 to 7 minutes. You are going to want to use a sturdy counter for this. The kneading technique is basically a one-handed slam dunk. To do this, grab one end of the dough, lift it off the counter and turn it in the air. And as you slam it back onto the counter, you will stretch and fold the dough over to the opposite end. You then grab the side and repeat the exact same motion, lifting it into the air, turning it, slamming it, etc. Don't be afraid to really slam that dough. The dough will start to become less sticky and more elastic and more difficult to knead. You can use a Kenwood mixer for this. However, you will want to watch your dough so that it doesn't become like an overbeaten egg. Form into a rough ball by tucking the edges underneath and cover with a cloth. Make sure it isn't a fibrous one. Let the dough rest for 20 minutes. Resting the dough helps your bread develop a better crumb color and a more porous interior. During this rest, the flour also continues to absorb the water. Now add the salt, kneading again using the same motion as before, until the dough reaches a temperature of about 25 degrees Celsius. To know when your dough is ready, check for window pane. Window pane is basically when you can stretch a small piece of dough paper thin without breaking it. Another way to tell when your dough is ready is that the dough will be smooth and elastic. Some people also describe it as feeling like a baby's bottom. Now you will need to get a tub and oil it with a vegetable oil of your choice. Here I am using olive oil. Don't use a metal bowl for this, as metal conducts heat too quickly. Form the dough into a ball and place it in the tub, seam side up, and then cover with cling wrap. Let the dough ferment away from drafts at room temperature, which is about 21 to 25 degrees Celsius, until it doubles in volume. This takes about 3.5 to 4 hours. If your room is too cold, place the dough near a stove, etc. And if your room is really hot, try to find a cooler spot, like a cupboard, etc. Another option is a proof box. Bakers use proof boxes which maintain a warm and high humidity environment to ferment their dough in. You can make your own sort of proof box by placing your tub of dough into a black bag and then blowing it up. During this proofing process, the dough is not only doubling in volume, but it's developing the special characteristics that give sourdough bread its sour taste, chewy crust, open-holed interior, and elasticity, and its creamy color. To tell when the dough is ready, place your hand lightly on top of it. It should feel slightly flabby and cool on top, but its center should feel firm. Also, when you press on the dough with your finger, a slight indentation should linger there. If your dough under-ferments in the early stages, it will lack flavor, strength, and maturity, which cannot be compensated for later on. Also, if your dough over-ferments, it will be too weak to hold its shape as it proofs, and too weak to grow to its optimum size when you bake it. Now comes the pre-shaping. To do this, remove the dough from the tub and place on a lightly floured surface. Cut the dough into 2 equal pieces and gently tap on the table to deflate the dough. Pre-shape the loaves by tucking the edges underneath in order to form a ball. You're basically suggesting the shape to come. Don't make it so tight that it starts ripping. Lightly sprinkle your pre-shaped loaves with flour and cover with a clean cloth. Let them rest for approximately 15 minutes. For the final shaping, you want to create a taut ball by tucking the edges underneath and by applying pressure in a circular motion as shown here. Prepare 2 proofing baskets by flouring 2 cloths and placing them inside 2 tubs that are large enough so that the dough doesn't overflow when it doubles in size. Another thing when choosing your tubs is that you don't want them to be too wide, as the dough will grow sideways instead of up and you'll end up with a rather flat loaf in comparison. Make sure that the cloths are floured well enough so that the dough doesn't stick to them. Better to be safer than sorry. Place your shaped dough into your proofing baskets, seam side up, and lightly flour the tops. Cover the tubs with cling wrap and secure with elastic bands. Let the dough rise until it has at least risen by 1/4, approximately 1 hour, and then place into the fridge to retard for 8 to 12 hours, but not longer than 24 hours. I have skipped the rising part and just put them straight into the fridge before, and my loaves still turned out great. Remove the loaves from the fridge and let them rise at room temperature until doubled in bulk. You may want to remove the cling wrap and lightly flour the tops again, covering them with a cloth. Removing the cling wrap will help your dough rise quicker than it would if left on, as removing it allows the temperature of the dough to rise quicker, instead of retaining the fridge as cold. You can tell when the dough is proofed and ready by using the same method that we used earlier. Heat your oven up to 200 degrees Celsius and place a pan of hot water in the bottom. You want to create a steamy environment. In addition to this, spritz cold water into your oven with a spray bottle. If you have an electrical oven, I'd be careful and you may want to skip spraying inside it and rather add more water to your pan. Also, spraying inside an oven with a light bulb may cause it to explode, so do take these things into consideration when baking sourdough. Another way is to rise your dough in a glass dish that has a lid. That way you can place the lid on when baking your bread, trapping the steam inside, and once the bread is baked enough, you can remove it from the dish and continue to bake on a wire rack. Remember to grease the dish first before rising the dough. Lightly sprinkle flour on top of the risen loaves and carefully remove them from the tubs, placing them smooth side up onto baking paper. If your oven is big enough to fit 2 loaves, you can bake them simultaneously. Take into account that they still rise somewhat. Otherwise, leave the other dough in its tub until you have baked the first loaf. You can also take the other dough out of the fridge later on, so as to make sure that you don't overproof it. Sprinkle flour over the top of the dough, and then, using a really sharp knife, slice a 45-degree angle cut, about ½ an inch deep into the dough, making a backward C. Use your other hand to steady the dough. Note that with overproofed dough, cuts that are more shallow than usual help to keep the loaf from deflating whilst baking. If the dough is underproofed, a deeper cut can help to keep the loaf from over-expanding to the point where the insides blow out in places. Correct cutting, also known as docking, complements the proof. The docking on a loaf is not just for decoration, but helps the loaf to reach its proper shape and height when baking. It also allows moisture to escape the dough. Carefully move the loaf on the baking paper to a preheated tray. I use a solid metal grid as shown in the video. You could use a fine grid wire rack for this. Spray the oven again and then place your loaf inside it. You must spray 2 more times during the first 5 minutes. Now leave the oven closed for approximately 20 minutes. You want to maintain the steam that you've created. After 20 minutes, check the loaf and rotate to ensure even baking if necessary. Spray inside the oven again, being careful not to spray the loaf. Continue baking for another 20 minutes. You can tell when the bread is ready if you knock on the underneath of it and it sounds like a hollow thud. Place the baked loaf onto a cooling rack. Let the loaf cool before cutting it, as the sourdough flavor doesn't fully develop until the loaf is cool, and the open interior also looks better after you have let it set. In a way, the bread is still baking, giving off carbon dioxide, and so eating it right away may give you an upset stomach. When you've cut from a loaf, you can place it cut side down onto a wooden board to keep it fresh. It also freezes really well. With some practice, patience, and time, you can figure out what works best for your sourdough bread, and you can perfect your loaves. It does take work and planning, but the results are so rewarding and worth it.